Good day, everyone. I am Queenie Ann Waira Sidhu from BSAIS 4A, and I will be presenting my research paper entitled Accounting Information System Practices of the Selected MSMEs in Santa Cruz, Marinduque. To start with the introduction, micro, small, and medium enterprises have been accepted as the engine of economic growth and promoting equitable development worldwide. The MSMEs constitute over 90% of total enterprises in most economies and are credited with generating the highest employment growth rates and account for a significant share of industrial production and exports. Micro, small, and medium enterprises are defined as follows: micro businesses with 1 to 9 employees, small businesses with 10 to 49 employees, and medium businesses with 50 to 249 employees. And the local MSMEs are defined differently in each country and are based not only on the number of employees, but also on the inclusion of a small business. Accounting information systems play a critical role in the success of the business organization, and it's also an essential resource for today's MSMEs. MSMEs must manage their accounting and finances effectively to maintain and improve their business. Next is the statement of the problem. The study aimed to find out the practices of accounting information systems on the selected MSMEs in Santa Cruz, Marinduque. This study was conducted to answer the following questions. First, what are the accounting information system practices of the selected MSMEs in Santa Cruz, Marinduque in terms of inputting or entering data, storing data, processing data and additional computing amounts related to transactions, aggregating or summarizing data and presenting data. And number 2, what challenges did the selected MSMEs encounter in accounting information systems? And last, what interventions can be proposed? Research methodology. In research method, a descriptive method of research using a mixed method, both quantitative and qualitative research was used. The researcher planned and organized the materials or questionnaire that would be required to gather data, and a survey and interview were used to collect opinions and ideas from the respondents in both qualitative and quantitative research. In research population and sample, the researcher used purposive sampling to obtain the sample, and as respondents, the researcher will consider 10 owners or managers of the commerce industry in Santa Cruz, Marinduque. Results and discussion. Results and discussion. In inputting or entering data, records accounting transactions using the traditional or manual system with a mean rating of 4.70 and verbal interpretation of extremely practiced. Records accounting transactions using a computer and accounting software with mean rating of 4.35 and verbal interpretation of extremely practiced. Manually input data from a paper and enter into a computer system with a 4.35 mean rating and extremely practiced verbal interpretation. Next is gather and document essential information concerning events that have an economic effect on the firm with a mean rating of 4.65 and the verbal interpretation of extremely practiced. And last, records all the financial events in order to generate financial reports with a mean rating of 4.60 and a verbal interpretation of extremely practiced, with a total of mean rating of 4.53 and a verbal interpretation of extremely practiced. Next is storing data. Paper-based method of storing with mean rating of 4.70 and a verbal interpretation of extremely practiced stores information into the computer system's database with 4.25 mean rating and extremely practiced verbal interpretation. Maintain relevant data for future use with mean rating of 4.65 and verbal interpretation of extremely practiced. Next is preserve financial data for the retention period of 5 up to 10 years from the date the records were created, with a mean rating of 4.70 and verbal interpretation of extremely practiced, and a total of 4.58 mean rating and extremely practiced of verbal interpretation. Next is the processing data and computing additional amounts related to transactions. Utilize the traditional journal, ledger, worksheets, and adjust entries manually with a mean rating of 4.50 and verbal interpretation of extremely practiced. Mechanical data processing using mechanical devices such as typewriter, mechanical printers, and mechanical devices with mean rating of 4.25 and verbal interpretation of extremely practiced. Electronic data processing with mean rating of 4.55 and verbal interpretation of extremely practiced, and ensure to produce a high-quality accounting data and reports with a mean rating of 4.50 and verbal interpretation of extremely practiced, with a total of 4.45 mean rating and verbal interpretation of extremely practiced. Next is aggregating or summarizing data. Manual data aggregation using pen and paper with mean rating of 4.70 and verbal interpretation of extremely practiced. Automated data aggregation with mean rating of 4.30 and verbal interpretation of extremely practiced. Income statements, balance sheet, cash flow statement, and shareholders' equity are prepared. Mean rating of 4.35 and verbal interpretation of extremely practiced. Last is financial statements are faithfully represented with 4.75 mean rating and verbal interpretation of extremely practiced with total of 4.53 mean rating and verbal interpretation of extremely practiced. Last is the presenting data. Provides with a clearer view of daily firm operations through financial reports with mean rating of 4.60 and verbal interpretation of extremely practiced. Analyze and communicate reports to decision makers with 4.35 mean rating and extremely practiced of verbal interpretation. Reports presented are relevant and timely with 4.55 mean rating and verbal interpretation of extremely practiced. Required information are clearly presented and understood by the users for sound decision making with 4.55 mean rating and extremely practiced of verbal interpretation with a total of 4.51 mean rating and verbal interpretation of extremely practiced. Next is the conclusion. The accounting information system practices of the selected MSMEs in Santa Cruz Marinduque is interpreted as extremely practiced by the respondents in inputting data, storing data, processing data, and computing additional amounts related to transactions, aggregating or summarizing data, and presenting data. Next is the recommendation. So first, since the respondents are proficient in computer skills but still need to improve in running the computer system and using applications, they should offer seminars and training on the subject that are both practical and relevant for the owners and employees of the MSMEs in Santa Cruz Marinduque. And since most of the respondents using manual systems are willing to adopt computerized information systems, they should offer seminars and training for the employees to have basic knowledge in operating the systems correctly.